My name is Jennifer O'Brien. I'm a researcher at the Crimes Against Children Research Center and associate professor in the Department of Social Work at the University of New Hampshire. And I'm so glad to see all of your faces today. If you're watching this later, I'm so glad that you're taking the time to do that, and I appreciate you and your attention. And for folks who can't be here, of course, I appreciate all of their hard work and efforts as well. I'm going to kind of be changing the focus a little bit. I am primarily a researcher, and I'm sharing the findings from one of our larger research studies that's going on at the center. So I think that you'll find that a lot of the research findings and sort of the data that I'm presenting here will sort of be woven through the other things that you're learning today and all of the other presentations. And I'm happy to kind of go through piece by piece of this study and give more details for the sake of the audience and really getting to the nitty-gritty of the findings. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth around analysis, but I'm certainly happy to do that with you if that's something that you're interested in. So this study was funded by NIJ, the National Institute of Justice. The formal title of the study is The Impact of Child Sexual Abuse Material Investigations Among Law Enforcement Personnel. We refer to it as the Police Wellness Study. Again, my name is up there, also Kimberly Mitchell, Lisa Jones, and Ateret Gerwitz-Maiden. These are folks who helped prepare this slideshow. Dr. David Finkelhor is the director of the Crimes Against Children Research Center, and although he was not part of putting together these slides, he was, of course, an integral piece of the study. So before I get too far into it, I just want to talk a little bit about what I mean when I say child sexual abuse material, and I fully acknowledge that many of the people sitting in this room or watching know very much what this is, but just so that we're all on the same page about kind of what we measured and how we functionally defined this term for the study. Child sexual abuse material included production and possession of child sexual abuse material, child pornography, online sexual solicitation, so live videos, live feeds, whether or not there was a commercial element, as well as the commercial sexual exploitation of children, or when there is that commercial element involved in the online exchange, whether that's for money or other items of value like drugs, rides, cryptocurrency, gaming currency, things like that. And we know from talking with survivors for many years now, as well as probably you all's individual work, that child sexual abuse victimization and child sexual abuse material victimization really doesn't happen in a vacuum. When we look at victims of this crime, we know that right around 90% have a history of child maltreatment in the home. That could be child neglect, other forms of abuse. Many are homeless, housing insecure, have run away. Particularly for youth who are being sexually exploited, 75% have experienced homelessness or housing insecurity. Many have substance use. It's a little unclear, substance use puts you at a greater risk of being involved in CSAM victimization. It's also an outcome, right? So children who have experienced this form of victimization are also more likely to use drugs. So we see that this is something that co-occurs similar with school issues or truancy, that children who are not in school are at greater risk for CSAM victimization, and in addition, youth who are not in schools are more, children who are involved in CSAM victimization may be less likely to attend school on a regular basis. And finally, health issues, and we've kind of lumped these together in terms of both mental and physical health issues. 90 to 95% of known victims of CSAM have seen emergency medical personnel for various reasons, whether that's ambulatory care, emergency room care, or seeing a PCP more than twice a month for a 6-month period. So in terms of first responders to CSAM victimization, police and law enforcement are really at the front lines, and there are a number of dedicated teams and investigators that do this work. So ICAC task forces, Internet Crimes Against Children, has special funding specifically for these types of cases. Specifically, a lot of CSAM material is shared via the internet, so it makes sense that Internet Crimes Against Children task forces would do that work. There's also special investigators as well as civilian investigators that do some of this work. There's a variety of divisions, so there's HSI, the FBI, there's also state and local departments. But then there's also just the vast types and variety of crimes that fall into CSAM. So I very nicely put this into 3 little squares there at the beginning, or circles, but the reality is that we know that there's a lot of overlap, that it really looks a little bit more like a Venn diagram than it does these nice little circles that fall outside of each other. So there's a variety of different volumes, ranging from 1 video or 1 picture to hundreds of thousands of images. There's severity, of course, the egregiousness of the images varies quite a bit. And then there's the frequency of watching. So some folks, this is only a small piece of their job. For other folks, it's the entirety of their job. And so they're really steeped in this 40+ hours a week. And we know that that has an impact, right? So when we started this study, one of the big questions was, what is the impact of looking at these images and kind of being involved in this work as a law enforcement officer? And we were shocked to find that really nobody was studying that. So there are some folks, specifically on Australia, doing this work, looking at the impact, the psychological, mental, physical health impact, but not necessarily just for CSAM viewing. But that research really indicates that law enforcement are differentially affected by job stress, and the egregiousness of the crime matters. So when we think about, holistic well-being and how law enforcement officers are doing, or law enforcement personnel are doing holistically across their lives, not just how they're doing at their job, but how they feel in their relationships, how they feel in relation to other people in their lives, how they feel in their communities, how proud they are of their work, how much they really want to do that work. We see that when the well-being goes down, job performance also goes down, and so does turnover. And that's a huge loss to our community at large, right? Because when folks have been doing this work, they know the ins and outs of this work. They get really good at looking at specific pieces of images and reporting on that and writing reports and catching the bad guys and all of that kind of great stuff. When you start to really not enjoy your work and you feel really stressed about it, you don't do that as effectively or as efficiently. And while there's quite a bit of, variation in terms of individual stress tolerance and how folks might deal with that stress, it still has an impact on well-being, as well as all of these other job-related pieces. So to kind of answer all of these questions, we wrote up the police wellness study. And to answer this gap, what is the impact of CSAM viewing for law enforcement personnel? And are there things that we can be doing better? Because we're hearing from police, we're hearing from law enforcement that this is an increasingly large piece of their work. And so the police wellness study had 3 main aims. The first was to gather information about agency as well as individual level practices and trainings that mitigate trauma and promote resilience. Then we wanted to understand the impact of CSAM exposure on investigator stress, physical health, mental health, and relationships. And really our kind of hypothesis there, right, was that if you were seeing more egregious images more frequently, that would have a negative impact on well-being. And then ultimately we wanted to develop a brief self-assessment tool to help investigators determine if they might need some sort of external help. So thinking about, whether or not that had to do with how much they were seeing, how much they were affected by it, other pieces in their life. We kind of wanted to be able to give a tool that individual agencies and officers could use so that they could do that self-assessment and be connected to different resources. So we got this study in 2019, which was a tricky year to do research, as you can imagine. So we actually ended up doing most of the data collection in late 2020 and then through 2021. We got a one-year extension on the grant, so the grant is actually ending in December of this year. The data has been collected, the data has been analyzed, but just to kind of give you a sense of the length of time this took, but then also kind of the point in time and the realities of that time in our collective experience, right? That there was just a lot going on collectively in 2020. We had 500 police investigators, forensic examiners, and others who were connected with the criminal justice system fill out an online survey that was anonymous. We had quite a bit of variation in terms of the folks who participated. The majority were male. We had 37% female. We did dichotomize gender, so we did not have an option for non-gendered individuals or folks who maybe were gender fluid. The majority were between 35 and 54 years of age, but we did have quite a bit of variation. We had folks in their early 20s all the way up into their 60s participate in the survey. Majority were white, majority were married, and just over half, 63% identified as parents and 10% identified as grandparents. So sort of speaking to that piece of you're watching CSAM, but you have, a young person in your life that you care about, and to think about whether or not that potentially made an impact. I mentioned ICAC earlier. ICAC task forces come with specific federal funds for police wellness, so we wanted to really kind of think about them separately in our analysis because there's just different resources that are available with that program. So 88% work as part of an ICAC task force program of our sample. So that's a pretty big piece of our sample. And probably a big piece of that is we actually our research center works very closely with the National Criminal Justice Training Center, who does a lot of work with ICAC task forces, does a lot of training with ICAC task forces. And so we recruited and sent out this survey link through different announcements through the National Criminal Justice Training Institute. And then we actually showed up during trainings for the ICAC virtual commanders meeting and then the ICAC virtual conference. So that's part of why our sample looks that way. If you look at this pie chart, what you'll see, and might be a little bit hard to read, is basically 41% of our sample said that 75% or more of their time was spent looking at CSAM cases, and then that blue percentage is that 50 to 74%. So we had over half of our sample was looking at CSAM for over half of their time, so quite a bit of exposure. So we had this survey and we asked a lot of questions. I'm going to go through specific questions that we asked so that you can kind of see how that fits into the results. But in addition to the survey where we were asking questions like, rate on a scale of 1 to 4 how much this happens, or on this, pick the response that best fits your feelings or your experience, we also had some open-ended questions. And specifically, we really wanted to ask folks their most challenging or stressful cases and get a sense of what was challenging or stressful about those cases, as well as their description of the outcomes. Not just so that we would know the description of the case and the outcome, but also so that we could get a sense of what sort of words and feelings were being used to describe those cases. So 152 individuals gave that information, and it really did a lot to add nuance to the quantitative findings, right? So we got a lot of details that we wouldn't have gotten just from numeric responses. I promised you I wouldn't go too deep into the data analysis, and I will hold true to that promise. But we did use kind of a variety of different statistical techniques. I'll talk about a little of them here, but mostly what I'm going to report here are descriptive statistics, which means that from this 500, you anybody could take a calculator and kind of look at percentages and kind of what that means. So there's nothing, I think we all have read a lot about all the ways that statistics can be used to be misleading. I just want to put out here really early in describing these findings that that's not what we did here. We didn't impute, we didn't change anything, we didn't use different pieces of the sample to look at different things or omit certain things. These are really just descriptive statistics, things like means and standard deviations. For the qualitative work, that means those open-ended responses, we use something called grounded theory, which means that I didn't read any of those responses with anything in mind other than just hearing and feeling the words that were on the page. So I didn't use any theory, I didn't think about the research questions, I didn't think about what was there beyond simply reading through and thinking, wow, what is really sticking out to me here? 2 people did that at the same time, myself and another PhD level colleague, and then we compared what we were reading so that we could make sure that we were reading the same thing and getting the same sense, right? So that my personal bias wasn't changing what I was reading on the page. That data triangulation is something that we use a lot in research. It adds rigor or strength to the study because it helps us make sure that we're not, again, looking either at the numbers or at the words on the page and bringing in our own biases and maybe changing the true meaning. So now I want to kind of get into the findings, so the meat of the presentation here. And the first research question, if you think back to the study, was really about promoting resiliency and thinking about individual and agency level harm mitigation strategies. So that's what I want to talk about first. And so in thinking about that, I also think it's important for you all to hear kind of how we asked folks about this. So in that survey, we asked about the presence of training programs that were related to CSAM. We asked about policies or resources that were available that were specific to CSAM. So this could be things like meetings that were around CSAM content, daily opportunities for CSAM investigators to debrief with each other, administrative updates around case outcomes. So we asked about how frequently things like that were happening. But we also asked about agency supports independently of CSAM. So things like, do you feel like you have some job flexibility? Do you feel like you get time off if you need it to attend to personal needs, family needs? We asked how much respect was given to personnel who were investigating CSAM crimes, and you could answer anywhere from none or very little all the way up to a lot. And then on a scale of 1 to 4, how large of a problem they felt that 9 different issues were in their agency. And it's just a kind of an idea of what we asked. We asked, are there enough people to conduct forensics exams? Tell us about the volume of the cases, tell us about the severity. So we really wanted to kind of get a sense, of all of these pieces of CSAM severity and frequency, and we had 9 different domains that we looked at. So in addition to those agency strategies, we also asked about individual strategies. So we had 20 items. We developed those items in connection with the National Criminal Justice Training Institute, as well as 5 different focus groups with forensic examiners, asking different things that they had heard or different items that they thought they had used at different points to help mitigate the harm and promote their own well-being while they were looking at these images. So you could rate anywhere from I don't use that at all or never to I use that all the time or often. And some of the examples were things like taking breaks from the material, taking deep breaths, reducing the size of the image, and then changing the image to black and white. So we asked a lot of questions like that. So here is what we found. At the agency level, we found that the #1 thing that changed all of the exposure when we controlled for severity, frequency, and the outcome, which is mental and physical health, the #1 thing that changed and impacted that was the implementation of an officer wellness program. and that the access and encouragement to use those programs made a huge difference in terms of how much of a difference that officer wellness program made. So there were some agencies where it was not optional. Everyone had to go in for counseling every week. It was mandatory. And there were other places where folks felt much more stigma, and so it was much less used. But in all cases, regardless of that, having an officer wellness program available by itself, regardless of utilization, impacted wellness. Addressing barriers to wellness stigma was a really huge barrier that was discussed by law enforcement personnel in this study, feeling like they wanted to use resources but being worried that others would see them utilize these resources was a big barrier. Peer support opportunities were also came out as significant. So building different exercises and as well as non-judgmental vent time between investigators so that they could kind of talk about their work and have an opportunity or a venue to do that. And then finally, easy access to known strategies that promote wellness that really didn't necessarily have anything to do with CSAM. So having access to exercise opportunities, friends and family events at the agency or at the workplace, as well as flexible work hours so that if they needed to leave and take care of different things that they were encouraged to be able to do that and come back at another time. And then these are some of the individual level harm mitigation strategies used by investigators. And I've just highlighted these here, and I've only given the percentages of people who said 4. So remember, you could rate all of these different strategies on a scale of 1. I never use it to 4. I often do it. So 63%, for example, for this first one, said 4. So we didn't group often and all the time, sort of. So the first one was focus attention on the task and not the content. So just thinking about that switching off what you're seeing and really thinking about what you're seeing and just focusing on the task of what does the perpetrator look like? What does the victim look like? What does the room look like? Try not to focus on any image or video for too long, 59%. Some folks even had a timer. They described using a timer. Remind yourself of the importance of the work, 59%. Turn the audio down or off, 53%. This was actually discussed quite a bit in the qualitative responses, as I'll get to in a little bit. 52% take breaks from the material you're viewing. Most folks also, in terms of taking a break, talked about actually leaving their desk to take a walk. Imagining the successful outcome of the case, talking to other officers, investigating the case, and then 37, listening to music while working in cases where that was an option. So obviously some really great and important findings here, just in terms of different harm mitigation strategies, different ways to promote wellness. Perhaps the most unanticipated and interesting finding from this entire study that we really saw early in this very first paper or analysis was that the volume, severity, and frequency of CSAM did not have any association with mental health outcomes. It didn't matter. Once we controlled for the volume, severity, and frequency of CSAM, if there were other harm mitigation strategies going on, whether it was a lot or a little, it was the same impact. So there were other things that seemed to make a difference and seemed to be kind of associated with these things like severity and frequency, things like knowing the outcome of the case, feeling a sense of control over what cases you were handed, feeling supported and appreciated in your role, and engagement in that officer wellness programming, that seemed to be associated with the severity and the frequency, so that if you had more volume, for example, or more severity, more frequency, that collectively, having higher scores on all of those things, if it really helped, for example, to know the outcome of the case, and that there was some association there. But once we controlled for those things independently, the CSAM pieces were not associated with mental health or emotional health or physical health. The other thing that started coming up a lot was burnout. So this idea of burnout, or just sort of feeling burnt out on your job, burnt out on your agency, burnt out on your coworkers, we saw that there was a really close association with mental and emotional health. So when you're doing statistics, one of the really base assumptions is that you can't have too many things in a model that are associated with each other. And they have to be really closely associated for that to actually be an issue. But you can't put burnout and mental and emotional health in the same model because they are too closely related, which is really interesting. That's not always true, but it is true in this sample and for this population of folks. And when we look at correlation tables, so looking at how closely they're associated with each other, we see that they exacerbate each other, right? So when we have folks who have high burnout, burnout seems to exacerbate mental and emotional health. If there's existing mental and emotional health issues, it intensifies burnout. You can have burnout and not have mental and emotional health, poor mental and emotional health, but it's pretty rare. And when we in fact look at things over time with other groups of law enforcement personnel who maybe don't necessarily look at CSAM, but we look over time, we see the same thing happen, where if we look at different time points, you might have low burnout, but lower mental health, mental and emotional health scores, and over time, burnout goes up more quickly than for peers. So the next question on our study was kind of that impact on well-being, understanding the impact of CSAM exposure on investigator stress, physical health, mental health, and relationships. So this was the next major goal of the study. And just as kind of an overview, when we look holistically at the data, as I mentioned before, CSAM exposure really wasn't linked to stress or relationships either. It wasn't linked to any of those outcomes. But things like burnout, PTSD, and anxiety were related. So burnout and health ended up being related also to relationship satisfaction. We looked at both intimate relationships as well as social relationships. The outcome was stronger for intimate relationships. One guess for why that might be is that you're presumably closer with folks that you have an intimate relationship with, your spouse, your partner. We saw that there were a couple gender differences there. So for example, depression had the largest impact for women, PTSD had a larger impact for men. They were statistically significant. As a social worker and former clinician, I would say that some of those gender differences might be due to how those internal traumas are manifested in behavior. So women generally have more internalizing symptoms, right? So they kind of internalize things that hurt a little bit more than men. And PTSD does have a component of externalization, and so it might just be captured better by those measures. And finally, we talked about group connectedness. We asked folks about how connected they felt both with coworkers as well as groups in their social lives. And group connectedness was a very large protective factor related to relationship satisfaction. So you could be pretty burnt out and have pretty poor mental and emotional health. But if you had some group connectedness, you felt connected to a group, regardless of whether it was a group at work or a social group, you had more relationship satisfaction, both in terms of your social connections, but also intimate relationships. So what does this mean when we're talking about coping or, protecting yourself when there's a particularly stressful case? So this is where we kind of get into adding nuance, right? So when we look at the survey results overall, it's any case. But what about your most challenging cases? Those are the ones that stick with us. Those are the ones that, we remember for years to come. And so we went back to the online survey and we went back to the qualitative data, so things that folks had written. And we asked folks to think about the most challenging or stressful case. We asked them to describe the case. But then if folks described the case for us, we snuck in a couple questions as well where they could rate things. And those 17 items asked about cognitive appraisals, which were basically like your thoughts on the case. Like, do you feel like it went well? Do you feel like you handled it well? Do you feel like there were the supports that you need and the help that you needed? You could rate the outcome of the case on a scale of 1 to 5, as well as rate the effect on your perceived well-being or how you felt after the case. And then you could also qualitatively describe or type in the outcome and those impacts. So we did something called a principal components analysis, which is a little bit of a fancier way to analyze data. But basically what you're doing here for a principal components analysis is you're looking at all of the data together and you're trying to see what people answered questions similarly, right? So who answered these questions? Kind of everybody rated these as being really high or having a really negative experience or a really positive experience, or certain aspects were positive versus negative. And what we found was there were 4 factors overall, and each of these factors had different means in terms of their mental and emotional impact when they think about the case. So we looked at the outcome of how they felt about the case later. And while I won't get into each of these, I can individually if folks have questions, but just to kind of, I guess, highlight, what we see here is factor 2, which is emotion and victim focus. This means that when you describe the case or the outcome, you talked a lot about, used emotional language and a focus on the victim. You have the lowest mean score on mental and emotional health, which means they're hurting the most, right? And then factor 3, which is cognitive and system focused. That means that you described the cases in terms of using heady language, not emotion language, and focusing on the system and how the system failed or didn't fail. Really, in terms of thinking of that switch is all the way off, right? They have the highest well-being score. So speaking, I think what we already know and probably already feel, which is that when you kind of shut off that emotional reaction, cognitively distance yourself, that there are some protective pieces to that. So this is one way to think about it. You have, I've got to change this one. You have the factors mapped out on a graph, and what you can see here, is kind of that you can have emotion focused or cognitive focused, and then you can have system focused or victim focused, and they're kind of grouped separately. And these are the specific questions. So I'm going to go through each of these boxes individually, but I'm also going to provide some example quotes so that you can see some of the words that folks used. So for emotion and system focused, this was things like talking about job-related stress when talking about that most challenging case. Several people talked about suspect suicide and how that led to a lack of accountability. Like, we caught the guy, but now he's not really going to pay for it because he killed himself. Lack of support and understanding by coworkers, and then an overall kind of disappointment in mankind. So here's an example quote. You have to just stand by waiting for legal processes and appropriate personnel to assure the greatest outcome, and it's stressful. They might still be offending, and the younger they are, the less story they can tell. So the next box was this emotion and victim focus, and just as a reminder, these are the folks who had the lowest mean score for emotional and mental well-being. So really talking about an emotional toll, usually linking it to family life, really focusing in on the age of the victims in the images of the most challenging case, a trauma response. People talked about dissociation or having images come back to them in unexpected times, and then the severity of the content. So here's a quote. It was a video of a baby being sexually abused. The fact that the baby was being assaulted and I had the same aged baby at home at the time, I mistakenly forgot to turn off the sound during preview. It was horrific. I had nightmares from it, and I couldn't listen to my own child at home cry for over a year without it triggering me. So here's cognitive and victim focus. This means concern over the victim, a lot of emotion-centered language around the victim. Some people talked about knowing the offender or knowing the victim, and that was kind of caused, a response. and then sounds and audio. So an example quote. So all my most challenging cases have one thing in common. I forgot to turn off the sound. You have to turn off the sound or you'll hear the poor kids forever. And then this is cognitive and system focused. Just a reminder, these are the folks who had sort of the highest emotional, mental well-being at the end, the highest scores. They talked about the volume of data, the stress of writing reports or describing cases, and then frustration with the legal process. An example quote. There was an enormous amount of data expected to be processed in an unreasonable amount of time by the court. Since this isn't my primary responsibility, there was a struggle to complete my normal investigations and complete the forensics on this investigation. So as you can see, there's not really any discussion of emotions or the victim. So in terms of important and maybe some unanticipated findings, there was this finding that emotional distancing was associated with better well-being by self-reported well-being for the individuals. This is not a new finding. We see this with a lot of first responders and folks who have trauma. We see it across cultures. So we see this same finding replicated across Europe, across South America, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, as well as Australia. There wasn't any difference in these findings, regardless of gender, age, or family structure. So you would think or perhaps expect that folks who had kids at home, that this might look different. It didn't. When we controlled for those things, it didn't make a difference in terms of the findings and what was significant. One thing that we didn't do that I think is important to acknowledge is these are self-reported well-being findings, right? So these are how people feel reporting that they feel. But we didn't ask their family, their friends, their partners, their primary care physicians. So it's possible that this is a block, right? It's possible that they're reporting to us an aspirational well-being score. We can never know that. And it's also possible that other family members might feel differently about kind of that switch. Burnout and stress and turnover were high for 3 of the 4 groups. So there was a statistically significant difference in terms of the 3 groups when we looked at burnout and stress and their desire to leave their current position. For everyone but that cognitive system-focused group, the mean scores for burnout and stress were quite high. And then for that cognitive system focus, it was statistically significantly lower. So now we're getting to the last goal of the study, which is a brief self-assessment tool. And this was really to help investigators determine if and when they might need some sort of external help. And we wanted it to be pretty easy. And also to be pretty effective. And so one of the things that I've talked about throughout this presentation and that kept coming up in the data itself was burnout. So we really wanted to kind of dig deeper into that question and that survey, what is burnout? And when you look at the literature, what we see is that it's consistently linked to negative mental health, emotional health, other negative outcomes, which I talked about a little earlier in the presentation. There can be personal and professional outcomes that it's related to, so it's not unidimensional, and it's talked about in multiple different forums. And what we see from previous work looking at CSAM investigators specifically is that when they're feeling more burnt out, both in terms of their own personal self-perception as well as outside measures, they're not doing their job nearly as effectively or efficiently. They're missing more things, but they're also just feeling done, right? So we often, and when they're done and they leave their positions, we have big gaps in training, case outcomes, and prosecutions. And this is something that we heard a lot about in focus groups was somebody left, it's taking a long time to find somebody to fill that position. Nobody wants to do it. It's really hard. So just really thinking that there's, there's some pretty big outcomes with burnout that would be important to catch early. So for our purposes and for this study, we defined burnout as a range of negative emotions related to work specifically. So specifically hopelessness, anger, decreased feelings of usefulness, less honor or feeling an honor to do the job or do the work or be part of the team doing the work. We found that in the qualitative results, it was used interchangeably with things like work-related stress or feeling done. Sometimes people talked about it in relation to mental health specifically, but work-specific mental health issues, like work makes me depressed. And then a real loss in interest in and engagement in work-related enjoyable activities, as well as a loss of interest in home-related enjoyable activities or things you previously gleaned enjoyment from. In terms of consequences, we saw we associated burnout with higher mental health symptomatology, meaning the symptoms were high enough to justify a clinical diagnosis. So that was how we defined it. So high enough scores on depression, anxiety, or PTSD scales that a clinician or psychologist could diagnose just based on that with one of these disorders from the DSM. Lower relationship satisfaction in both intimate and social relationship, higher negative coping. We asked about eating sugary snacks, alcohol, as well as isolation, and spending a lot of alone time. And then higher turnover, which we functionally defined as having the intention to leave your position within the next 6 months. So we developed a questionnaire. And this questionnaire has these questions, which I'm going to go through, and they're yes or no. So there's no scale. You answer yes or no to each one. So the questions are, do you have little interest or pleasure in doing things you enjoy? Feel down, depressed, or hopeless? Feel nervous, anxious, or on edge? Unable to stop or control worrying? Distant or cut off from other people? Have the experience of reliving a stressful experience? Avoid reminders of a stressful experience? Feel irritable, have angry outbursts, or act aggressively? Or feel that you are in fair or poor health? An affirmative response to 5 or more of these questions means that you are at a high risk of burnout. And when I say high risk, I mean that you are 18.5% more likely to have high burnout and poor mental or emotional wellness compared to your peers. And again, this is just the reminder that this includes a diagnosable DSM diagnosis when I say poor mental or emotional wellness. High burnout is the most likely, so this screening instrument might be most useful to use for folks who are within the first 4 to 6 years or 16 plus years. So you're pretty much, whether you're new to the job or you're in that 7 to 15 year mark, you are at the same likelihood of having high burnout, but you are much more likely in years 4 through 6 and 16 plus to score higher or have 5 or more affirmed. And the good news is that the mitigation strategies that we talked about early in this presentation do seem to have an impact on burnout. So for folks who do score high on this measure, which we're calling the burnt, you can use some of these mitigation strategies, engage in some of these other external supports, and your burnout will go down and potentially you wouldn't continue to score high on the measure. So this is a great way to kind of think through how to give supports to folks who might be in most need. So as with any study, there are some limitations to this one, and I just want to go ahead and point those out. We have 500 folks completed the survey. That's a pretty big sample for police and law enforcement. Obviously, there's a lot more than 500 law enforcement folks who do this work more generally. And we had limited knowledge about agency-level cultural climate. It was really important that the survey be completely confidential and anonymous so that folks could be candid. But certainly climate support and natural coping and whether or not that's supported at the agency level would likely have some impact on these findings. Is retrospective data, which means we were asking people to think back, particularly when we were asking them about their challenging cases. And then there was a sample bias. We oversampled from ICAC task forces. Even with these limitations in mind, this is one of the first mixed method studies on this topic and really one of the very few studies on this topic generally. There's just not a ton of research out there looking at police wellness. We're one of the few studies. Even though there's been a lot of calls for it, it's just not research that's widely done. We had a lot of diverse law enforcement personnel participation, and I think that this really points to the need for longitudinal studies as well as diverse studies when we look at well-being from multiple perspectives. We talked about really needing to ask family members, intimate partners, physicians, and looking at this over time to see how it changes, particularly around supports and how long those supports maybe take to make a real impact. So this last slide is just information about the study as well as our website to our center. The Crimes Against Children Research Center does work looking at police wellness and police level data. We also have quite a bit of research on other crimes affecting children like gun violence, lots of studies specific to online victimization and commercial sexual exploitation. And I'd be remiss if I didn't recite that this project was supported by a grant from the National Institute of Justice, but the points of view are the researchers and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of Justice. Thanks so much.